As John mentioned, I did this presentation last year, and so decided to resurrect it for this year. So it's three UA megatrends for 2016. So just a bit about myself. I wrote the book Freemium Economics. I'm the VP of User Acquisition at Rovio, and I run the website mobiledevmemo.com. So I literally took the presentation file from last year and then just filled it in with stuff for this year. So the format is stuff that happened in 2015 and then 3 things that I think will happen in 2016. So kind of taking a look back on 2015, what happened? So the first, I meant to edit this. That's supposed to say continued surge of video, not mobile. That's obvious. Continued surge of video ads. So, from 2.62 billion to projected 6 billion in 2018. So, video is obviously the sort of big, important, probably dominant format for mobile ads going forward. And you see that as a percentage, it kind of tops off at nearly half in 2018. So the continued decline of the mobile web is another big megatrend in 2015. So you see here that by Q2, there's less than 10% of time on mobile spent in the browser, and with increasing time spent on mobile. I think it's important because obviously the app is the way people interact with content on mobile, but probably more importantly than that, thinking about user acquisition, mobile web just doesn't really seem viable. That's not where you can reach people. It's not the most sort of comfortable way to consume content on mobile, and it's also really, really difficult to sort of engineer the kind of key metrics that you need to be good at on mobile in order to build a business, right? So it's really hard to engineer kind of retention on mobile, or sort of engagement, or to sort of constrict engagement to specific amounts of time. So I think just kind of wrapping that up conceptually, it means that I don't see the mobile web as being kind of a discovery mechanic. So the rise of the viral gimmick app. So there's any number of examples of these. Some of these were released in 2014, but I think all of these got really big in 2015. And Ketchup is not an app, it's a company that makes apps. But in 2015, they kind of hit their stride, I think, in terms of just being able to release stuff and scale it up really quickly. So this is Dubsmash on the left, which is the kind of video messaging app out of Berlin. So there's kind of 2 interesting things here. So one is, there was this sort of bifurcation in terms of marketing strategy, I think, that you saw take root in 2015. And so what that means is, okay, well, you had the sort of depth of gameplay that you'd expect from freemium apps, but then you had this sort of very superficial, one-dimensional gameplay type that kind of emerged in these viral apps. And so, one thing that a lot of these companies have in common is they were made by companies that are, just indies, right? They have no money for marketing, and they didn't spend anything on marketing. And so that became a strategy in and of itself, right? And that's really product-driven strategy. We're gonna make this type of game because this type of game can possibly take off virally, whereas the full freemium economy game can't. Another thing that's interesting about these companies, and so I chose these deliberately, is that none of these is based in the U.S. or even a big tech hub. Dubsmash, based in Berlin, you could argue whether that's a big tech hub, but the rest of them are from the hinterlands in terms of tech, and that's interesting to me because it almost makes a case for not being located in a big tech hub if you want to make these kinds of apps because, well, capital constraints, so it's just easier to do it outside of places that are expensive, and then B, I do think there's this kind of mentality that comes with being based in a not tech hub that sort of like forces you to think really globally. And I definitely, I worked at Skype earlier in my career, and I think that was very much part of why Skype became popular. Was this, built in a Tallinn, Estonia, which is, a small city. And the mentality from the very beginning was like, well, this isn't going to be a viable business if we focus on the domestic market or even in the European market. It's got to be global from day one. And I think it's easier for people that live in non-tech hubs to think that way. It's also easier to not get caught up in the echo chamber of ideas that Silicon Valley can sometimes represent. So another issue was the growing impact of ad fraud. So I don't think this has started costing developers appreciable amount of money yet, but I do think in 2016 it will. So it's something that is kind of like worrisome, but the problem is only going to get sort of worse. But I think in 2015 you saw that start to become a problem. And the incipient development of walled gardens, and I'll get into this actually here. So there's a couple things. So one, so Facebook brought this instant article content format onto the news feed. And what that does is it loads that content really, really fast. So you can instantly see the whole article within the Facebook news feed without clicking outside of Facebook. And it's faster. I mean, if they cache that. So for you to click out, it'd actually be like much slower to consume the content. So how is that a walled garden, and how does it relate to mobile advertising? Well, obviously, if they start doing that with other forms of content, that really could become an issue for promoting your own app, right? I mean, if Facebook wants you to consume all content in its app, where does it stop? I mean, does it stop at like sort of text-based content, video? How far does this go? So YouTube, Google has basically tried to start only allowing people to traffic ads on YouTube with their own ad trafficking tools. And so, I mean, obviously they own that inventory. Why shouldn't they do that? But again, it's becoming a walled garden, right? You want to advertise on YouTube, which arguably is the most important video ad network on mobile. Well, then you have to do it with Google tools. It's going to monetize you exclusively, and I'll get into sort of like one of the ways that kind of impacts mobile advertising later in the presentation. And then obviously Google trying to bring people onto its platform with analytics. And so the guy from Google was talking about A/B testing Google Apps. Well, that is how people A/B test store stuff now. So what's the sort of like impact of that? Well, if you're A/B testing on Google, then all your stuff is optimized for Android, right? And since you can't do that on iOS, it does make people kind of think, well, maybe I could be making more money on Android. Maybe I should focus on Android, be Android first. So 2016, what's ahead? This is a video, and it didn't work last year either. So this is the scene from Back to the Future. So Megatrend 1, so growth of this simultaneous second screen. So I mean, this is kind of clunky, the phrasing. I made that up. I don't know if there's like a kind of more pleasing way to say it. But what I mean by that is, so building apps to specifically tie into content that's being delivered on a bigger screen, right? And that doesn't, I mean, here it's the sort of iPad and the TV, but I don't think it has to be like that. It could be iPad and movie, in a theater, or whatever. But there's a couple of reasons I think this could get really big in 2016. So first of all, this kind of consumption model supports app features that are most tightly associated with spending money. So competition. So you can imagine, like, what is the one kind of type of content that people consume the most of on TV, and probably sports is up there at the top. Maybe it's even one specific sport. But people get very competitive about that. You just kind of look at like FanDuel and those types of companies to see that people are very much invested with their money in competing amongst their friends on like fantasy sports and stuff like that. So it's social. So obviously sitting and watching TV with your friends is a social activity. If you can kind of heighten that experience with some content on your phone, it becomes even that becomes social. That sort of like benefits the content on the phone benefits from the social setting, right? And so it sort of like does break down that stigma around spending money on IAPs. And it's time limited, so it happens for a limited amount of time, and that obviously kicks in a lot of the psychology around spending money. So I think there's, I kind of identify a couple of opportunities here. So one is kind of social fantasy sports. So people getting together, playing a game while partaking in the social activity of being with your friends and watching something on TV. The second is betting. I think that one's pretty obvious, and that one kind of already is happening with some of the bigger sports betting companies. And then content extension. I think this is an interesting thing that I think some companies have tried. That I think there are a couple of apps that you could point to in 2015 that tried to do this. I think it's really difficult to do because it's kind of like manpower intensive. But I do think like if you know, you were able to get a Game of Thrones app, say, that sort of unlocks content at the same time that you're watching the show and sort of like allows you to explore things that you couldn't in the show, I think there's like a lot of money to be made in that. I mean, obviously it's tough to build that kind of app, and you know, update cycles make things complicated, but I do think that there is kind of like a big opportunity in something like that. So the second mega trend, shift to managed services, and when I say managed services, I mean media buying. So I ran a survey on my website a couple weeks ago, and I just basically asked, okay, I asked a bunch of questions about how people spend money on UA. And so this was UA spend in kind of like bucketed ranges. So you see that there's basically this like no man's land in that sort of like less than 200K, between like 50K and 200K, there's not really many companies spending in that region. And you can kind of understand why, right? Like, so the $1 to 49,000, that could be like indie studios who can afford that. And then the 200 to 200K plus, you'd see, well, okay, obviously the big app developers are spending that much money, but why between 50K and 200K is there no one spending money there? Well, there's a number of reasons. Maybe, first, there's no kind of like middle ground in app success, right? So I mean, there would be no app where the business case would be sort of like propelled by, spending in that level. But I think another reason is that simply UA people are hard to find and they're expensive, and you do kind of need some sort of like minimum viable infrastructure to even do UA, right? So the $1 to 49K, that could just be somebody on Power Editor, but once you sort of advance past that, you do need analytics. You need attribution that somehow ties in to with your analytics system. You start talking about juggling SDKs, and so it costs you the same amount of money to get all that in place as it costs King or whatever. So it just doesn't make sense. It's not like commercially viable to operate UA in that sort of like spend range. So it could be though, if you were spreading that cost across a number of different, if you were just a UA company and you were spreading that cost around different clients, right? And there are agencies that exist, but they're not sort of mobile first, they're not UA first. I could see that becoming a part of the industry this year, or starting to, is these managed services that handle UA. And then going back to the point around hiring people, this is the UA spend broken down by team size, and you see the $1 to 49,000, that's one person, right? But then you can do that with one person, that's manageable, but beyond that, you need a team, and well, if you're spending 100K, can you justify having 3-4 people employed as UA managers? Not really, but once you get up to the 200K range, you can. But then those people, maybe the reason there isn't a middle class in the app development world is that, well, because of this phenomenon, right? You can't get marketing people to work in that sort of like, dead zone of spend. Yet, if you had a sort of managed service economy, then that suddenly becomes viable. So this is basically what I just said. Yeah, and I think the third point is just that if you're like an indie game dev, it's just a huge distraction for you to try to build out the analytics that you need to do UA properly, and not only is it expensive, but it just kind of that's vying for your limited time, and you're not able to sort of like as acutely focus on your mission, which is to build great apps and great games. And Megatrend 3, this is like something I see happening. I don't know if it's 2016, but I definitely hope it's 2016. So the growth of multi-device attribution. So programmatic advertising seems like it's probably going to pick up in 2016. So I mean, this is some eMarketer chart that shows that programmatic will become a bigger percentage of digital display. And then, as I said, video is only going to become more important in 2016. It's just the dominant advertising format. And so here's some charts that support what I just said. So kind of bringing those two things together, you're seeing a lot of ad networks who have kind of instituted this sort of very, I would say, punitive attribution methodology, which is view-through, right? So they attribute the views of video ads, and they say, okay, well later, you're not clicking on anything necessarily, but if you viewed the ad, then you're attributed to that ad, and if you download the install later, then that ad network gets that install. And what that does is creates an opportunity for these big networks, especially something like a Twitter, which you just kind of scroll through, to just essentially claim all the downloads, right? They just claim everything, and it's really problematic. First of all, it's just bad business. Second of all, it's like I said, it's punitive. It's not good for developers. And third, basically, that forces you to just choose, right? So like if I'm going to do a big video ad campaign and I have the company that has like a lot of inventory and they do view through, well then I'm probably just going to go with them, because if I don't, they're going to claim all the installs anyway, and I'm just going to end up double paying. So what does that mean? So if you do that, right, and you need to scale up, well, okay, if I'm serving video ads on my mobile, and I'm also serving video ads in like desktop newsfeed somewhere, and I'm also serving video ads on iPad something, it's impossible for me to really calculate ROI unless I can attribute the ad views to all those different devices that the user saw them on, right? So this has to happen. If it doesn't, people are just going to be throwing money out the window, and I really hope it does happen. I'd rather switch away from the view-through attribution model, but given that that doesn't really seem that likely, multi-device attribution just has to happen. Otherwise, there's really no way to spend money profitably, and basically any sort of video ad spend becomes brand advertising. It just becomes recognition and sort of like saturation advertising, and that then creates a barrier to entry for anybody except the biggest and richest developers. And so again, going back to this sort of walled garden idea, well, okay, if we're doing multi-device attribution, the easiest way and sort of like most accurate way is to take the deterministic approach, is to say, okay, well, we could go with like a probabilistic matching thing, but it's not going to be accurate. I'm Google, or I'm some big company, and I have your user login. Well, then I become the de facto advertiser of choice, right? Because, well, I can tell you exactly who saw this on what devices, because they're always logged in when they're using my service. I own my own inventory. And then it's like, well, then it makes no sense for me to advertise on different channels. Just go with the big person. Go with the person who's got me logged in, who's got me on every device that I own, and who has chosen to go with view-through attribution. So yeah, that's it. Those are the 3 ones. Thanks very much.